climate change and immigration policies become new articles of faith in the Catholic Church? And is Mary a co-redemptrix with Jesus in salvation? The Prayerful Posse will explore it all next. Welcome to an important Prayerful Posse. Be sure to go subscribe to the show. It's a wonderful way to support our work, and it's totally free. Or visit RaymondArroyo.com. Let's convene the Prayerful Posse. Canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray, and editor-in-chief of the CatholicThing.org, Robert Royal, joining us from Europe, a very mysterious Europe, it looks like, Bob. Gents, Pope Leo has been making a lot of headlines this week. During one of his press gaggles outside of Castel Gandolfo, the Pope offered up a very pointed commentary on what appeared to be U.S. immigration policy.
The role of the church is to preach the gospel. And just a couple of days ago, we heard Matthew's Gospel, chapter 25, which says, Jesus says very clearly, at the end of the world, we're going to be asked, how did you receive the foreigner? Did you receive him and welcome him or not? And I think that many people who've lived for years and years and years, never causing problems, have been deeply affected by what's going on right now. And I would certainly invite the authorities to allow pastoral workers to attend to the needs of those people. Many times they've been separated from their families for a good amount of time. No one knows what's happening, but their own spiritual needs should be attended to.
Father, your thoughts on the Pope wading into immigration policy, particularly at a time when Europe is literally convulsing over this issue of unfettered immigration?
Well, I'll start with the second half of that comment. I agree with the Pope that chaplains, priests should be allowed in to visit those being held in detention centers by ICE and Border Patrol. The question is, though, they have to be qualified. They have to be there, knowing who they are, what their reason for being there, because this is a prime time for political activism, for grandstanding. So that's not why a chaplain goes in to see people who are being detained. On the other part, yes, we do have to greet foreigners and do what we can to help them. But that doesn't mean foreigners have a right to illegally enter the country or overstay their visa. And the fact that they've been here a long time, yeah, that's not a good thing, because that means the previous governments have been, lax in enforcing the law. But when you begin to enforce the law, there's no offense there. And in fact, the government, as we know, is offering people here illegally the chance to voluntarily repatriate to their home countries, and then they'll have an opportunity to come in legally. So I think the American government is only doing what is according to the law and the will of the American people, which is, if you want to be in the United States, you have to be here legally.
A while back, a man I didn't know showed up at my front door. He'd found my address online, and he wanted me to deliver a letter to someone he'd seen on one of my shows. My family was inside. And that's when I started taking our digital safety seriously, because the threat doesn't end at the doorstep. For too many seniors and families, the bigger danger isn't someone finding you, it's someone becoming you. Rerouting a Social Security deposit, opening credit in your name, filing a fake tax return, even sticking you with medical bills using your Medicare details. Most people discover it when the bank or collectors call. How does it happen? Data brokers build and sell dossiers on you, your name, your address, phone, income, even your family ties to anyone willing to pay. They don't vet the buyer. Scammers, spammers, stalkers, they all get through. That's why today's sponsor is Aura. Aura finds where your personal information is being sold. It removes it and keeps it off automatically. More than removals, it's a one-stop shop for online protection. Dark web alerts, real-time fraud alerts for credit and banking, continuous monitoring, a secure VPN, antivirus, a password manager, and U.S.-based support around the clock. For parents and grandparents, Aura's parental controls connect your kids' devices to your app, so you can see exactly what your kids are seeing and block harmful content. Safety for every generation. For our Arroyo Grande audience, start your 14-day free trial at aura.com. That's AURA.com/Raymond Arroyo. Or scan the code. There's nothing more important than protecting your loved ones, and Aura does just that. Bob, your thoughts on this, and why has immigration policy been so elevated? I mean, the energy and effort expended on this from Rome and really throughout the church is something remarkable. President Obama, by the way, deported about 2 million people. I don't remember this kind of organized Catholic resistance, if you will, to that policy.
Well, I mean, we know that part of the reason is that the media plays at this point because of their sheer detestation of Donald Trump. They detest him for everything that he absolutely does. I mean, Obama locked up children inside chain link fences, but when Trump did it in his previous administration, this was apparently something new that had never happened on the face of the earth. I've got to say that I don't know entirely why the church is doing this. Clearly, as you say, Raymond, in Europe in particular, because the large majority of those illegals are Muslims, and we're seeing all sorts of cultural clashes, it just makes no sense. And I think that when Pope Francis, early in his papacy, went to Lampedusa, which is an Italian island very close to the coast of Africa, that he thought he was opening up a mode of charity and mercy. But in fact, he was opening up a series of problems for people in Europe. Now, here in the United States, fortunately, for the most part, the people who have come in are either evangelicals or Christians or Catholics, although there are a lot of criminals that have come in as well. And now I'm going to take a little bit of a perhaps controversial position about this.
Yeah.
Because I really do think that our government has a moral responsibility. If you've let someone live here 5 or 10 years, and they put down roots and they have a family and whatnot, I'm not saying that they should automatically be allowed into the country or regularized, but we have allowed, our government has allowed this situation to fester, and it's happened for many years now. We don't have, to this day, we don't have proper legislation about illegal immigration. We've got Trump, who's been able to shut down the border, and thank God that he did. But our Congress still needs to do, complete a kind of a thorough look at what our immigration policies should be. But look, that said, that's a political debate that has to be. If you've been here 5 years and if 10 years or whatever, and you haven't been a problem, maybe we can find out some way that you can stay longer, or you go back and you come in. And But what I want to say is this: I don't see why it is that the church talks about this sort of thing when I think everybody understands this. Here in America, we understand immigration. We like it. We like legal immigrants.
Yeah.
My family are immigrants. Yours, Raymond, and yours,
Mine too, yeah.
We all like this, and we all know it contributes to the country. But this illegal, this welcoming of illegals, it just seems to me, it almost sounds like the church doesn't have anything better to do at this point.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to say that, but it's like picking a moral question, and I think climate change participates somewhat in that as well.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in a moment. But a week when we learned, Father and Bob, that a German festival, that outdoor festival where they had that terrible tragedy, those people were killed by Islamic extremists, that Christmas festival canceled this year. The Christmas lights in Sheffield, England, canceled this year. There's a cultural aggression underway that I think the church, for whatever reason, is unwilling to examine or look at with clear eyes, Father.
Well, this is an issue which has to do with unassimilated Muslims. Muslim people in Europe who have come primarily for the economic benefits of being in Europe as opposed to their home countries, they have displayed little intention to integrate. And we had, just last month, we had an Islamic man with a knife trying to attack in a synagogue. And he had to be neutralized by the police. This is horrendous because there is a hostility to Jews in Europe that has not been seen since the Nazi period. Yeah. And the only possible reasonable explanation for it is to identify with this influx of Islamic people who don't like Jews and become violent. And this is really a problem. The Jewish soccer team was playing in England, and there were all kinds of problems outside the stadium. So, we have seen this when the Israelis were attacked by Hamas on October 7, 2 years ago. The following weekend, there was a huge march in London in support of Hamas. This is unthinkable. If there had been a Nazi attack on people, and then the following weekend 1 million people got in favor of the Nazis, I think the governments would have acted more.
Yeah, no, there seems, again, an unwillingness. If you're worried about religious freedom and the flourishing of religions in countries, you've got to, as a religious leader, focus on this in some way. Pope Leo also said, Bob, I want your comments on this. He said the U.S. military's actions against Venezuela, the narco terrorists there. Here's the quote: "I believe violence never brings victory. The key is to seek dialogue, to find fair ways to resolve the problems that may exist within countries." Bob, dialogue with the terrorists?
Yeah, I'm sorry to say that's the kind of language that I think during his period of formation in the seminary and in graduate school, that's the kind of language that people were encouraged to use. To begin with, I mean, let's make a Catholic distinction in language. There's a difference between the use of force, which may be just, and violence. I mean, violence is when I stab somebody, I want to rob them or whatever. I may use force to prevent somebody from robbing another person. So first of all, he's got to be clear about what that is. Otherwise, we're in a pacifism where everybody's supposed to be, getting along very well with everybody, and that's simply not the case. And look, in the case of Venezuela, we're dealing with one of those nasty regimes that pops up every now in Latin America. Venezuela used to be a very vibrant, democratic, and prosperous country. It has a lot of oil. It was well organized. And it went down the wrong path. It went down the wrong path in a similar fashion to what Argentina did in the past, and Nicaragua and some other countries like this. So, we're not just talking about a random lashing out with violence. We're looking at trying to prevent some pretty bad actors from harming their own people to begin with, but secondarily, the effects that they have when they bring drugs into this country and criminals, et cetera. So, look, he's partly right if he focuses the language a little bit better. But I don't think that this is a pope who yet has a grip on these kinds of international situations. And I often tell, whenever I'm criticized by some foreign diplomat, I often say, look, you guys aren't the ones that have to send in the troops if something goes drastically wrong in a place like Venezuela. We do. We have to send our guys. So we need to deal with things far ahead of their getting into an utterly impossible situation.
And Father, in this case, you had these narco drug dealers and terrorists coming in and bringing drugs meant to kill, and they do kill, swaths of our population. So there is a national security interest here. My question is this a little out of the purview and perhaps charism of the papacy to weigh in on something so granular and encourage dialogue in this situation?
No, I think it's proper for the Pope to talk about issues of foreign policy which have a moral aspect to it. And so there's a legitimate debate going on. Are narco-terrorists appropriate targets for the military? And that's a good debate to have, but we've already had in the United States because those groups have been deemed to be non-state actors of hostile to the United States, posing a real threat to it. And these people, by the way, they know this is happening, so they should stop their activities. They're the ones taking the risk of getting killed by the U.S. military. Let's not forget that. But then secondly, the answer to a criminal terrorist organization is not dialogue. That's regards the people selling the drugs. As regards the Maduro government, when have they gotten into a serious dialogue with anybody? Maduro's an illegitimate president. He wasn't elected. The other person was elected in the last election, but the votes were counted fraudulently. And who got the Nobel Peace Prize? The other candidate. So we should remember, he's an illegitimate president. He's using narco-terrorists to continue to gain money for himself and to put down the United States. So I welcome papal commentary when it's based on the set of facts and the moral equivalent. There's no moral equivalency between a military trying to defend the country and terrorists trying to kill people.
We all saw the Vatican hosting that climate conference, where the Pope was there and Arnold Schwarzenegger and the famous iceberg. Now the U.S. Bishops' Conference and other Catholic leaders are offering prayer and support and solidarity for the participants at the 30th Annual United Nations Climate Change Conference, which begins on November 10th. Secretary of State Cardinal Parolin delivered an address by the Pope, which urged more global action on climate change and said, quote, "Peace is also threatened by a lack of due respect for creation, by the plundering of natural resources, and by a progressive decline in the quality of life because of climate change." Father, your reaction about the message and this 11-day conference, is this the most pressing problem in the church right now?
It's not a specifically Catholic issue, climate change. That's a question of, first of all, science, because climate has changed many times over the course of the century. Is it man-caused? Is the genesis of activities that man has undertaken in the last 50 to 100 years that had never been undertaken before? That's a legitimate area of study. And from what I've seen, Bob knows more about this than I, so I'll cede to him, there's a diversity of opinion. But then secondly, the question is, what are the priorities that the Holy See is stressing? And basically in the first 6 months of the pontificate, we've heard a lot about immigration and we've heard a lot about climate change. But there are more pressing problems of particularly religious freedom. Now, the Pope has spoken about it, so I'm not saying yes, but it's not the headlines being made by the Holy See by and large.
Yeah. Bob, your thoughts on the optics of these gatherings when people are being thrown out of their parishes, which we'll talk about later, for just wanting to practice their faith. And there's such deep confusion about what the church itself teaches. Is this the best use of the moral clarity and standing of the Vatican at this moment?
Yeah, well, look, it is good to talk about the care for creation. There's nothing wrong with that at all, as Father was saying. It's not even so much that there's, I think, a debate about climate change as, I'm sorry to say this, because I actually started out in university studying science. I think science has been corrupted to a good degree because of the money that's made available for certain types of studies and not available for other types of studies. And I think we're starting to see that a little bit about what's happening in terms of climate change, to use that term. Bill Gates came out the other day, and he's been a massive supporter of population control and climate change activity. And he's saying, well, climate change probably isn't going to destroy the human race, and we'll be able to manage it. And I've been hearing this for years. As you know, I wrote a book about climate and religion years ago. And I've been hearing for years that mitigation and research really are much more important than this kind of grandstanding of these international conferences where people promise that they won't use fossil fuels 5 years from now, which is an utter impossibility, those sorts of things. When it gets to become a kind of a crusade, I think that we're in trouble. And look, as Father rightly says, there are other things. Elon Musk has stepped forward, to quote another billionaire who's prominent in the world, saying that our problem now is not population, overpopulation. It's demographic collapse around the world. So we have two of the most influential tech-savvy people in the world who are kind of contradicting a thing that has been carried on by the media and the universities and Hollywood and whatnot. And I think we're at a sea change point where people are going to recognize, look, we need to use the world in order to provide for people.
Yeah.
We don't abuse the world. We use it. We try to mitigate any harm we may cause. But that's just part and parcel of being the beings that we are, that God put us on this planet.
Yeah, it kind of boggles the mind that so much attention is spent. The Vatican uses so much of its platform to advance this climate change, both science and activism, which, as you said, you see a sea change now and a turning in the culture. And among those who have been the most voracious supporters of this, I don't know why the Vatican isn't having that self-reflection and at least saying, you know what, maybe we should stick to moral issues right now and really focus on what humans do to destroy each other and the world, rather than worrying about the environment and its natural changes and shifts. But speaking of confusion, the Vatican's doctrinal office released a doctrinal note to clarify titles attributed to the Blessed Virgin Mary this week. Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez released this document, Mater Populi Fidelis, which condemns the use of the title Co-Redemptrix for Mary. Now, we should say the document was initially prepared under Pope Francis, but it was signed off by Pope Leo with some revisions. Father, why is this needed now? Was there some outcry about Mary as Co-Redemptrix that we didn't hear about?
Well, I'll say I don't think the document was needed now because I don't think this was a problem. Now, there were two titles of Our Lady in particular which were addressed, Co-Redemptrix and then Mediatrix of all graces.
Right.
Co-Redemptrix means that Mary participated in the highest possible way as a human being in the redemption obtained for us by Christ, who is God made man.
Right.
So the church is not saying that Christ is not the Redeemer. There's only one Redeemer. But as St. Paul said, I fill up what is lacking in the suffering of Christ. So we participate with Christ because remember, we're part of the mystical body. We're united to Christ. And through grace, we cooperate with Christ. So co-redemptrix is a cooperator in bringing forward the fruits of the redemption to others. There is no thought that Mary died and then gained grace that way. No, Christ died and gained all graces for us. So now this has been debated, and this has been going back to the reign of Pius XII and even earlier.
Right.
And it's a controversial point in some ways, but it was tranquilly left to the realm of discussion. Now, the other title is Mediatrix of all graces. And a mediator, as you know, is someone who brings one thing from one person and gives it to another, and then back and forth. And the idea that Mary is the mediator of all grace, the Holy See has embraced that, and so have popes over the years, saints and theologians, and Pope Benedict XV authorized a Mass in honor of Mary, Mediatrix of all graces, for the people of Belgium. So that the idea there is Christ came into the world through Mary, and then Christ goes back to the world through her also, which makes a lot of sense because in the mystical body, we talk about the sharing of spiritual gifts. Well, who's the one who's got most gifts? It's Mary. So again, these are titles that you can embrace. I don't think it was useful for the Vatican to get into this debate now. And I'll just say one last thing, because it's very serious. Cardinal Fernandez said, terms which need constant explaining over the course of time should not be used because this is an indication they're not useful. Well, if that's the case, we should re-examine almost everything he's issued as the head of the doctrine of the faith, because synodality, we need an explanation every time the word is said. Fiducia supplicans, not we're going to bless couples, but not unions. What does this mean? Divorce and remarry can receive communion and Amoris Laetitia. Well, wait a minute. What about the teaching of the church that remarriage is a mortal sin? So, in other words, they should apply their own criteria to what they've done. Then we could have a serious discussion of, well, which really conforms to the gospel and which doesn't.
Yeah, Father jumped the gun a little bit on me, Bob. I was going to ask you that. Cardinal Fernandez, the excuse here for not using these terms is they could cause confusion. Well, if that's the new barometer of doctrine, synodality, transubstantiation, celibacy, and as Father mentioned, the blessing of these couples, they've got a lot of explaining to do. I love also how Pope Benedict is quoted in this document, because apparently he was not in favor of the Co-Redemptrix title. But then he's utterly ignored when he speaks about worship of Jesus in the Latin Mass. Bob, your reaction?
Yeah, I mean, this was really I leave the technical part of this to the theologians. They can argue this out. But, I go back to the point I made about use of force and abuse of violence. There used to be a time, I'm old enough, you guys are still young whippersnappers, but I'm old enough to remember when people used to say, at least you Catholics know what you believe. And it's true. We did. We had our language that we used. There were various elements of the just war theory. There are various elements of this and that. In the question of Mary, I was thinking about this when I saw that the terms when I was growing up, we didn't worry about these terms, which are kind of metaphorical anyway. Yeah. We always used to talk about there are three types of worship that people. You worship God with latria. That's this Latin term. Mm-hmm. And then other beings who are worthy of our respect and our attention. There's a Latin term dulia, which is, saints and angels and what. And Mary is hyperdulia. So she's between dulia and she's in latria. But there's no confusion possible there. When you're using terms that people can understand, you can go and look them up in any book. And instead, what we've been doing more and more is we're kind of promoting the idea that ambiguity and then discussions about things that can seem never to be able to be resolved are the way forward in the church, and we pasted this name synodality on it. So, look, I like definitions. Not everything, I mean, there are mysteries that go beyond what we can define, but we don't need to keep adding unnecessary mysteries that don't really help us. The mystery of the Trinity helps us. The mystery of the Transfiguration helps us, and many other mysteries in the church.
Yeah. Father, any last words on this? Do we need that title, Co-Redemptrix? Does it add anything that the church needs vis-a-vis Mary and her relationship to salvation and the Lord himself?
Well, Cardinal Ratzinger in the Ratzinger Report, you remember that groundbreaking book issued early in Pontificate John Paul II, he embraced a Latin saying, which is numquam de Maria satis. There's never enough about Maria, which is the attitude of the saints, the praise, the knowledge. So if this helps people to understand how blessed the Virgin Mary is and how connected we are to our salvation, then so be it. Since the Holy See, mediatrix of all graces, that's already been approved. It's very disturbing that they would disapprove it. Co-Redemptrix has been allowed as a term, and different saints have used it. John Paul II, I believe, even preached homilies on this. So I would say this is not a debate stopper. This is going to continue. And why the Holy See, when they ignore other things, is issuing documents about Marian piety. Where is a document, refuting some of the primary heresies of our time, including the transgender fraud? We need something of the same seriousness from the doctrine of the faith to explain to people that God made male and female and nothing else. That's what we need.
A couple of stories brewing in the ongoing liturgy wars that I want to bring to everybody's attention. Okay, after banning the traditional Latin Mass in parishes across the Diocese of Charlotte, the Bishop, Michael Martin, is now requesting that the Charlotte faithful stop using altar rails in their parishes. According to reports from the Charlotte Latin Mass community, the bishop made the request at a contentious 3-hour presbyteral meeting of his priests. Father, canonically, can the bishop forbid the faithful from kneeling at an altar rail to receive communion?
I would say technically he could refute. He could make a diocesan legislation outlawing altar rails. Now that I'm willing to defend that, but I could also be wrong on that. He's not able, though, to forbid the faithful from kneeling down to receive communion, because that's an option provided for in the Roman legislation. So it's an act of charity to give people a place to kneel if they have a right to receive communion that way. So this is a heavy-handed approach, and this is really where things get very, very upsetting to people. We have liturgical chaos in the Catholic Church with priests doing all kinds of things. You and I have seen videos over the years. We've talked about it. Priests riding bicycles down the main aisle. Priests throwing rugby balls, kicking soccer balls. We had a priest dressed up as a rapper recently at a mass. Okay, so what are they trying to stop? That? No, all of that activity seemingly continues. No, they're trying to stop people from kneeling down to receive communion? This makes absolutely no sense. What is the purpose of receiving communion? It's the bread of eternal life. Why would you interfere with someone's piety if they're trying to come closer to God?
Yeah, Bob, I mean, look, we say this often, and everybody watches this and watched this over the years knows my motto is the practice is as important or more important than the stated doctrine, because that's the lived doctrine of the people. And if they want to kneel and show that sign of reverence to the reality of Christ in the Eucharist, why deny them that? These are the tactics, and Father mentioned heavy-handed tactics, that you wonder, where is the synodality for these people? Where is the listening and accompaniment for these people who were just thrown out of their parishes? Now they can't even kneel at the altar rail for communion any longer.
Well, look, if you're willing to ban the language of the Mass of the Ages, to pick up a few fences. It's kind of a minor. I think from a certain person's understanding, it feels like a minor thing. Just as it appears that he's ready to ban all sorts of other things at the altar. Look, we know what this is. What this is it's a kind of a progressive attempt to damp down the kind of vertical worship that was so prominent in the past, perhaps even excessively. I mean, I think we could have a debate about liturgy that would maybe even bring in that point, but not throw it out entirely.
Right. But
there is this vertical dimension of the faith. And we see in these kind of progressive changes in liturgy that it's always being attempted to kind of make it more of a meeting, to make it more synodal in that certain sense of everybody's got to, nobody can impose anything on anybody else. Everybody gets to have a voice, and even this, and they're doing this even as they're declaring that they're not moving toward a more democratic church. This is just a conversation. So part of that confusion that we just talked about a minute ago. You're quite right. It embodies itself in these little changes that little by little, as small as in a way you could say it is, little by little, the cumulative effect is intended to play down that vertical dimension and kind of make us just, all one on the face of the earth. Right. I'm sorry to put it that way. Maybe it's a little too simplistic to put it that way, but what other explanation is there?
In a related story, it was reported earlier this week that Bishop Larry Kulik of the Diocese of Greensburg, Pennsylvania, intended to ban the ad orientem Novus Ordo masses in his diocese. Now that means the English masses where the priest is facing away from the people to the high altar. So they're all facing the same direction. As of Friday, November 7th, the Catholic Herald reports that the Diocese of Greensburg is not, in fact, banning those masses of people facing away from the people. The Mason-Dixon Latin Mass Society first reported the news of a ban. The story went viral. According to the diocesan communications director, quote, "No, this information is not accurate. No directives at the diocesan level have been issued on the celebration of the Novus Ordo ad orientem." Now, here's the question, Father. Your thoughts on the environment that has developed now in the parish communities in the United States. I think what we're seeing is they're so shell-shocked at this point in the wake of this assault on Catholic tradition that any rumor, any report, people kind of go crazy. They worry deeply.
They do worry because there's a trend to restrict rather than to liberate the forms of liturgical expression that are traditional in the life of the church. Now, I'll just point out, the local bishop does not have the power to ban Mass said ad orientem, meaning toward the east, the liturgical east, meaning that the practice of the church, the practice of the Orthodox Church, the practice of Eastern Catholic churches is to face east because the liturgy is an anticipation and a waiting for the coming of Christ the second time. And second coming, the church understands, will be from the east. So that's we're looking east because we're looking toward Christ. So the bishop doesn't have the power to do that. Now, a number of bishops have done it in their diocese. Right. This is not allowed. The Roman legislation is clear. The Congregation for Divine Worship has made this clear in communications to various people. But the atmosphere, again, you have to say to yourself, what in the world is the genesis or origin of all of this? And I think part of it is a fear that people who like to worship in the traditional form are going to reject everything that's happened in the church since the Second Vatican Council. I think that's an unfounded fear. They are unhappy with certain liturgical aberrations, and they're happy with the restoration of tradition. But that doesn't mean these people have to be treated as if they're attacking the church and the Second Vatican Council. That's not the case. I'd be interested in what Bob thinks about that.
Yeah, and I think to go back to some of the things we were talking about earlier, if we're really in a church that needs to recover a sense of the sacred, to refocus on some of these fundamental moral questions that you raised earlier, Raymond, and particularly if you want to engage the environmental questions, why not use the astronomical elements that exist? I mean, to look toward the sun. I mean, we're not worshiping the sun the way some sun worshipers would, but we are connecting ourselves with the nature of God's world, the way
Yeah.
that the stars and the planets and the moon and the sun move around us. I mean, during the Middle Ages or the early church, there were allegories about animals and about other things. This was not worshiping creation. It was drawing out meaning from creation. And that's what really attaches you again. It isn't just kind of an abstract scientific determination that you can only allow so much CO2 to go up into the air. No, you have to care about the world first. Just like you have to care about other people to demonstrate charity. You have to care about people in the womb to understand the fragility of the human race. If we don't reproduce ourselves, there's no future for us.
Yeah. Bob, that's such a great point.
I think there's just a depth here. And I think Father is right that and as are you, Raymond, that on one hand, some people are just terrified of any change now because they just fear that they feel like a locomotive is coming down the tracks and they're losing everything. But I think that's wrong. I think that we need to be a little bit more flexible, but let's engage those tools that have existed in the tradition for years that help us embody, in the way that our postures, the way we face, the way we talk to one another. Those things too add a tremendous amount. And our bishops, a lot of our bishops in the United States know this, by the way.
Yeah.
So, we've got a debate going on, but I think that those positive elements need to be underscored because we continue to lose something and we're fighting over things that are trivial by comparison.
Yeah, that's a great point, though, about the orientation of facing east. It's where the sun rises. It's the way God made our planet move. All of that is tied together, and it's a pity that they miss the moral and practical implications of the reverence for tradition and creation. That's all one. But they miss that, and we run to UN conferences and accept, debated science and dubious solutions that now even Bill Gates says, maybe we don't need to go down this path. On a story we've been covering now for years, the Vatican trial of disgraced Jesuit Marko Rupnik is finally getting underway. The Pope was asked by EWTN News at that press gaggle we mentioned earlier about Rupnik and the case against him.
Certainly in many places, precisely because of the need to be sensitive to those who have presented cases of being victims, the artwork has been covered up. Artwork has been removed from websites. So that issue is certainly something that we're aware of. A new trial has recently begun. Judges were appointed, and processes for justice take a long time. And I know it's very difficult for the victims to ask that they be patient, but the Church needs to respect the rights of all people. The principle of innocent till proven guilty is also true in the Church. And hopefully this trial that is just beginning will be able to give some clarity and justice to all those involved.
Father, what do you make of the Pope's request for Rupnik's victims to be patient and his take on the art saga and whether it should continue to hang in church installations?
Yeah, well, they've already been patient. I'm sure the Holy Father's aware of that. When the Vatican promised to when they lifted the immunity that Rupnik had for prosecution, and it took almost 2 years, at least a year and a half for the judges to be named, and then another half year for the judges to convene. So there has been, but once a trial's convened, there should be an orderly process that doesn't take months and months and months. Now, again, we don't know what's going to happen in the trial. And this is really a problem, you could say, about Vatican jurisprudence and the way they operate.
Yep.
If you announce that you are going to have a trial, why didn't they announce the start date of the trial? Why didn't they tell us who the judges are? Why didn't they produce a press statement saying, these are the following charges, and then, go from there? Vatican justice is not up to modern standards of public justice, the administration of trials and investigations and all the rest. And, the victims had to say they're kind of like spectators on this because the accusation is being made by a Vatican prosecutor against this man. So the Vatican is prosecuting on behalf of the people. So I hope, for instance, let's hope every victim who wants to testify is given the opportunity to do so. And that is also allowed to make their testimony known to the wider public. Because this is a matter of public interest. We already have through the media, and let's face it, without media pressure, none of this would have happened. The victims went to the media and they gave tremendously personal and tragic stories of what they claim, I think truly, Rupnik did. It's now time to resolve this, and not simply, the McCarrick trial was a perfect example. It was an administrative process. They issued like a 2 or 3 sentence at the end, and he was thrown out of the priesthood. There was no accounting for anything that he did in the public sphere, and that was, I think, not in line with the way modern justice systems work.
Bob, let's talk for a moment about the art itself. Look, there's been a lot of kind of tone-deaf behavior, I think, from the Vatican. The Rupnik art itself, now the Pope reference there, what I think is the removal of the art from the Vatican website. We'll see if that proves true. Is there any credibility in the eyes of the victims at this point, not just of Rupnik's art, but the ongoing presence of it in these churches? Should it be taken down, do you think?
Well, let me start with from a slightly different point. As I understand it, he is still a priest in good standing.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so he's still operating, which is, for us in America, it's astonishing, because when a priest is accused here and there seems to be some credible evidence, he's out, and then the process goes forward. So already we're starting from a position that is pretty strange. And then this artwork stays up, and there seem to be elements within the Vatican press office and some of the public relations offices that deliberately include some of his art and continue to do this in things that they're publishing. So I begin with that to me that is very odd, and I don't know why a man like this would still be protected. He should be, I don't know if he should be sent away or whatever the process should be, but he should not be doing those two things. Now, in terms of art, pretty much I don't like censoring art after the fact. I mean, Caravaggio was a terrible man, murderer. There have been other artists who were less than saints, but their art was good. Rupnik presents a strange case because there were sacrileges involved.
Right.
And
with the art itself, Bob.
Yeah, abuses of the sacrament at the altar, of confession. So just if you're a serious Catholic who takes seriously the theology of the sacraments, there's that element that's thrown on top of it. So all this, to me, it just militates against that stuff continuing. I don't like censoring art, but I think in this case, the violations were so awful and involved sacred objects and sacred matters that you simply can't leave them around and continue to think of yourself as a serious Christian church.
Yeah, Father, I don't even want to get into the details because they're so diabolical, frankly. But I mean, when you're putting human fluids and mixing them in paint and using them in the mosaics in your art, there's something profoundly disordered in all of that and wicked. And I think that has to be part of the consideration as to whether this should still hang in these churches and institutions all over the United States, the world, even in the Vatican.
Yeah, I mean, let's, by analogy, if he has been accused of committing other types of crimes rather than sexual abuse of nuns, which is the main accusation, would the Vatican have been so passive on this? Let's say he had taken a gun and tried to shoot Pope Francis. Would any of his art be allowed to stay anywhere? Of course not, because it would have been recognized this is a malicious man who did evil. We should have nothing to do with his artwork. On the other hand, he's reliably accused of sex abuse. He's thrown out of the Jesuits. He had been excommunicated by the Vatican because he gave absolution to one of the people that he raped or sexually abused. Yeah. So he's already proven by his record to have been found guilty of crime. And yet we're tiptoeing around saying we got to keep his art because we don't want to. No, we don't do this. We have to be serious. Is the purpose of a church to give an artist an opportunity to display his work? Of course not. It's the house of God.
Yeah, and the work should draw you to worship of God. And with all of the competing agendas and material in that particular art, I agree with you. I think it's a particular case where you have to say, cover it up or move it out. Gents, the German Synodal way rolls on as we reported and continue to report. The Italian church seems to have caught Synodal fever. It's embracing the recognition of gender ideology and homosexuality. For example, Pope Leo, since his election, has repeatedly affirmed synodality and following in the footsteps of Pope Francis. America Magazine has just published a piece, an article called Synodality Fatigue. What's their cure? Just get good at it, they suggest. Bob, your reaction to this idea that the way to cure synodality fatigue is get more synodal, whatever that means.
Yeah, and of course, that's just the problem. We've been saying this for the last 10 years. That, and the answers you get from people is, well, it's a process. And as it goes along, we'll define what it is as we go along. But yet it's the most urgent thing that ought to be happening everywhere or around the world in the church. Yeah. Look, you can say conversations are good, but I have to say, when I looked at the pictures that accompanied that article in America Magazine, it reminded me of some of these sad, confessional circles that you used to see back in the 60s when people thought that they were letting it all hang out and they were being honest with one another. I mean, it almost looks more like an AA meeting than it is something about, putting together a way of understanding the church and doing better at evangelization. Yeah. So, all this just indicates that it is, for all the talk about how well it's doing, it's breaking out all over the world, it's in crisis.
Right. Yeah, it's in crisis, and as you said, it looks like a sterile gathering. I would argue AA meetings have far more are far more impactful and positive than anything coming out of this synodal way. And Father, I guess the solution is keep doing the synodal shuffle. Are we any closer to what a real understanding is or definition of synodality? Do we actually know what it is?
Well, we know what real synodality is because it was given to us by the Second Vatican Council and Pope Paul VI. Synodality is a meeting of bishops to consider matters of importance in the life of the church and provide advice to the Roman pontiff. That's what synodality is. Those that the bishops seek as experts can be anybody, but only the bishops are involved in synods. Pope Francis changed that and then made it, a process such that the message of this article is, if you're tired of having been on the treadmill for 3 years, just get used to it and keep going for as many more years as is necessary. This is ridiculous. And I should also throw this in. When the people who like synodality admit that people are tired of it, it's not a good sign that they have confidence that this thing is doing its job. Right. And it can't do its job because what synodality means is whatever they tell us from the Vatican, it means when they issue their next document. And of course, as you may know, they canceled in advance the next synod. It's going to be replaced by an ecclesial assembly in which we're told that it'll be at least 50% non-bishops present. So even the synod is not synodal enough, even after all the changes. This is a perfect formula for an academic type revolution where the faculty gets rid of the president and says, okay, tomorrow the next decree will tell the students what we're going to teach them. But by the way, it could change next week.
Yeah, no, it's all very confusing. And the reality is, it never caught the zeitgeist in the church at large. Let's face it. You go to a local parish, you go to your parish or my parish or Bob's parish, nobody's talking about synodality or wanting to be more synodal. They don't even know what this means. A Catholic philosopher, Ed Fesser, wrote something this week that speaks a bit to this synodal question and the idea that some are waiting for another pope to undo the rigid traditions of the past. He says, the thesis that a pope can contradict what has always been understood to be the consistent teaching of Scripture and tradition is not and never has been the doctrine of the Catholic Church. It is a diabolical distortion of the magisterium into Orwell's ministry of truth. Bob, your reaction, he underlines the example of the death penalty, that a good Catholic can oppose it in practice, but that it can never be intrinsically evil, because that would contradict Scripture and tradition, doctors of the Church, 2,000 years of papal teaching. Your thoughts, Bob?
Yeah, Ed Fesser is a very, very fine philosopher. He's a very careful thinker. He's very loyal to the tradition. He knows the tradition. So when he speaks about these things, he isn't just speaking off the top of his head, the kind of thing that he would like to be true. He's in the very center of the tradition. I read his book. I think I even endorsed it when it came out. And he quotes from Avery Dulles, the Jesuit theologian who was made a cardinal by John Paul II. And Dulles pointed out that if, let's say, Pope Raymond Arroyo today contradicts Pope Robert Royal of yesterday, well, everybody can look at that and say, oh yeah, that was great. That was a great change that he made. But that introduces the principle that any pope can overthrow the teaching of his predecessor. And so, yeah, you're riding high today, Raymond. You're the boss. You're on a Arroyo Grande. But the next guy comes along and he contradicts you. And now we're off to the races. There is no stable doctrine. There is no stable truth that exists within the church. And it's not just over the death penalty. It has ramifications for all the doctrinal and moral teachings of the church.
Yeah, it undermines and weakens the whole foundation. Father, you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, no, this is absolutely true. We send people to seminary to train to be priests, and the first lesson is not, the Catholic faith consists of whatever the Pope tells us today it means. No. The Catholic faith consists of the memorial teaching based on the scriptures and the tradition of the church, which has been enunciated over the course of the centuries in councils, in theologians of good repute and orthodoxy. In other words, there's a whole body of teaching. Bob wrote a great book about the 20th century theological tradition. And what was that based on? The 19th centuries that came before it. It wasn't based on the fact that a pope woke up and said, well, today we're going to take 5 out of 10 of teachings, and then 5 are no longer applicable. No, this is unfortunately, it's the politicization of the papacy and religion, where the thought is, just like a new president has a new set of priorities, his platform, a new pope can do that. He can't. He cannot do that. And this is why we've said this. I've said this before. We've said it here. We can't sit by and say what Pope Francis did about divorce and remarried, communion, blessing of homosexual couples, and capital punishment. This is now definitive Catholic teaching that cannot be contradicted. No, these were innovations which contradicted what previous popes taught. These have to be cast aside if we're going to be consistent, because otherwise everything's subject to question. And there are some people who want that in the church. We know that. So we have to fight that. That's the good fight of faith.
Yeah, it's a bad trend. It's a bad idea, because you do undermine and weaken everything that preceded you. And then, as Bob was saying earlier, Catholics were always regarded as knowing what they believe. Well, then everything's up for grabs, and that's a very bad place to be. I want to ask you all, before we go, there is a new document on monogamy that the Doctrinal Office of the Vatican is allegedly working on to be released soon. Bob, your thoughts on this, and why do you think this is coming now?
Oh, I could have some thoughts that I'd rather not express about this. They're a little dark and perhaps a little cynical.
Okay.
We all kind of thought that monogamy was a pretty much settled and perfectly clear concept.
Yeah.
And we'll see what it is when they get through with it. It seems to be we're going to have more questions than answers.
I'm wondering if this is going to be a document on polygamy. And the reason I wonder about it is at the Synod, some African bishops said that the synodal concern has to be, finding a place for polygamous people in the church. And that reminds me that we're still waiting for the 10 study groups, the 10 particular study groups for controversial questions. And polygamy was one of them. So I don't know if this is going to be related to those study group teachings. And by the way, if it's still under study, why is the Vatican issuing teachings and not waiting for the synodal process to accomplish itself? The real story here is monogamy is threatened by all those sexual licensed practices in the modern world, including so-called same-sex marriage. So hopefully the document monogamy is going to be rejection of pseudo-marriages, which are these blessings of homosexual couples who are already civilly married and view the blessing as a confirmation by the church that they are in fact married. That's the reality on the ground. If they don't deal with that, then this is just going to be further confusion.
Posse, we could go on for an hour more, but I'm going to let you all rest for now. Grateful to you for always, as always. And if you want more of the Arroyo Grande Prayerful Posse, subscribe to the Arroyo Grande Show on YouTube or the Arroyo Grande Podcast, wherever you get yours. On behalf of Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray, until the posse rides again, stay the course and follow the light. I'm Raymond Arroyo. We'll see you next time. Arroyo Grande is produced in partnership with iHeart Podcasts and DP Studios and is available on the iHeart Radio app or wherever you get your podcasts.